Summer 1456 A.T. The Sultan, known as the Conqueror, brings the world's greatest army and thunderous cannons to the gates of a battered city. Inside those crumbling walls, hope is all but gone. A forgotten general rallies a ragtag band of peasants, priests and mercenaries, outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by their king. Outside, 100,000 Ottoman soldiers prepare to erase Belgrade from the map. But when the first cannonballs crash through stone, something extraordinary happens. The defenders refuse to break. Faith clashes with firepower, and desperation turns into defiance. This is not just a siege. This is the moment a handful of heroes stood against an empire and changed the course of history. To understand just how impossible this victory was, you first have to understand the man marching on Belgrade. This wasn't just any sultan. This was Mehmed II, known to his enemies as the terror of the world, and to his subjects as Fatih Sultan Mehmed, Mehmed the Conqueror. And just 3 years earlier, in 1453, he had done what no one thought could be done. At only 21 years old, he had conquered Constantinople. The city had stood for over 1,000 years, its legendary Theodosian walls turning back dozens of sieges from Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, and Crusaders alike. It was the heart of the old Byzantine Empire, the Second Rome, and the last bastion of Eastern Christianity. Mehmed broke it in just 55 days, and he did it with strategic genius and a terrifying new form of warfare. The Sultan's secret weapon was Orban, a Hungarian engineer who had first offered his services to the Byzantines. When Constantine XI couldn't afford his price, Orban crossed to the Ottoman camp and built massive, powerful cannons that could turn 1,000-year-old stone walls into dust. The largest, nicknamed Basilica, was 27 feet long, weighed 19 tons, and could hurl 1,200-pound stone balls over a mile with devastating accuracy. With Constantinople's fall, a shockwave of terror shot across Europe. Church bells tolled in mourning from London to Naples. Mehmed was no longer just a sultan. He was the Caesar of a new Roman Empire, and his ambition had no limits. He saw himself as the heir to both the Roman Caesars and Alexander the Great, destined to build a world empire stretching from the Danube to the Indian Ocean. But to push west, to march on Vienna, Rome, and the capitals of Europe, he first needed to secure his northern frontier, and that path ran straight through one critical fortress, Belgrade. Sitting at the strategic confluence of the mighty Danube and Sava rivers, Belgrade was more than a city. It was the gateway to Central Europe. Its position controlled the main invasion route from the Ottoman heartland into Hungary and the vast plains beyond. For over a century, it had stood as the last major Christian stronghold on the Danube, a fortress that had withstood over 40 previous Ottoman attacks. The city itself was a formidable challenge. Built on a high bluff overlooking the rivers, Belgrade consisted of two main sections, the lower town where merchants and craftsmen lived, and the upper fortress where the garrison held out. The walls were a mixture of old Serbian stonework reinforced with newer Hungarian fortifications, creating a maze of bastions, towers, and defensive positions. Mehmed knew that to conquer the West, he had to take Belgrade first. More than that, he needed to take it quickly and decisively. A prolonged siege would give the fractured kingdoms of Europe time to unite against him. He was bringing the entire force of his empire to ensure Belgrade's swift fall. His army was a spectacle of 15th-century military power the world had never seen. While medieval chroniclers exaggerated its size to over 150,000, modern historians place the Ottoman force between 60,000 and 70,000 men, still massive by the standards of the age. This was a professional standing army, the most advanced and disciplined military force of its time. At its core were the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry corps. These weren't ordinary soldiers, but boys taken as children through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and raised from birth to be perfect warriors. They were fanatically loyal to the Sultan, brutally effective in combat, and the terror of every Christian battlefield. Armed with composite bows, scimitars, and increasingly with arquebuses, they had never known defeat. Supporting them were 20,000 Sipahi cavalry, the Ottoman equivalent of knights but faster and more flexible. These were the provincial nobility of the empire, granted land in exchange for military service. They fought with lance, bow, and saber, and their charges had broken armies from Persia to the Balkans. Behind them came a massive supply train of camels, mules, and oxen, carrying everything needed for an extended siege. Tents for a city-sized camp, food for months, tools for siege works, and most importantly, the materials for the Sultan's artillery park. And then there were the cannons. Mehmed brought an artillery train of around 300 pieces, from small anti-personnel guns to massive siege mortars. Among them were several enormous siege cannons, the same type that had shattered the walls of Constantinople. The largest required teams of 60 oxen to move and could fire stones weighing up to 1,500 pounds. One legend claims some of these cannons were cast from the melted-down church bells of Constantinople, a story that may be myth, but shows the psychological terror Mehmed inspired across Christendom. As this immense force moved north through Serbia in the spring of 1456, its destination was no secret. European spies reported every detail of its approach, and all of Christian Europe held its breath, praying for a miracle they had no reason to expect. While Mehmed marched with the unified power of an empire, the Kingdom of Hungary was falling apart from within. It should have been the natural defender of Christendom's frontier. Hungary was a large, rich kingdom with a proud military tradition and a king who claimed descent from the great medieval warriors. But in 1456 it was a realm paralyzed by fear and political squabbling. King Ladislaus III was just 16 years old, more interested in Renaissance art and Italian politics than in defending his northern borders. The powerful Magyar nobility, who controlled most of the kingdom's wealth, were locked in bitter feuds with each other. They refused to vote taxes for a national defense, each hoping their rivals' lands would bear the brunt of any Ottoman attack. The Diet at Buda had debated the Ottoman threat for months without reaching any decision. Some nobles argued for appeasement, others for asking the Holy Roman Emperor for help that would likely never come. Most simply hoped the problem would go away. The result was paralysis at the very moment when unity was desperately needed. It seemed no one was willing or able to stand in the Sultan's way. No one, that is, except for two men who couldn't have been more different but were united by an unshakable will to defend their world. The first was John Hunyadi, born Janos Hunyadi to a minor noble family in Transylvania around 1407. If anyone in Europe understood the Ottoman threat, it was him. Hunyadi had spent his entire adult life fighting the Turks across the Balkans, earning a fearsome reputation as the White Knight of Wallachia and the most successful Ottoman fighter of his generation. He had won stunning victories at places like Semendria, Kruševac, and Niš, breaking Ottoman armies and earning the respect even of his enemies. Sultan Murad II himself had called Hunyadi the greatest enemy of our faith. His tactical genius lay in combining Hungarian heavy cavalry with Balkan light horse and infantry, creating a flexible force that could match Ottoman mobility while maintaining European striking power. But Hunyadi had learned hard lessons too. He had suffered crushing defeats at Varna in 1444 and Kosovo in 1448, where the flower of European chivalry had been destroyed by Ottoman discipline and firepower. He knew the Turks' strength better than any man alive. He understood their tactics, their weapons, and their ruthless efficiency, and he knew Belgrade was the final line of defense. If Belgrade fell, Hungary would be defenseless. The Ottomans would pour across the great Hungarian plain like a flood, reaching Vienna within weeks. Beyond that lay the German lands, France, and Rome itself. The entire Christian world hung in the balance. But Hunyadi had a terrible problem. He was a general without an army. The Hungarian nobles, despite all his pleas and warnings, had refused to provide money for a relief force. They claimed the royal treasury was empty, that their own estates needed defending first, that surely the fortress could hold out on its own. Left to raise a force at his own expense, Hunyadi could muster only his personal retinue, about 3,000 of his own knights and men-at-arms, plus 7,000 loyal mercenaries from his previous campaigns. These were veteran soldiers, seasoned fighters who had followed him for years. But 10,000 men, however experienced, were a pitifully small force to face Mehmed's legions. The second man was everything Hunyadi was not. Giovanni da Capistrano, John of Capistrano to the Hungarians, was a 70-year-old Franciscan friar from Italy, sent by Pope Calixtus III to preach against the Hussite heresy in Bohemia. His mission changed completely when he saw the existential threat of Mehmed's invasion. Capistrano was a remarkable figure, even by the standards of his remarkable age. Born into minor nobility in 1386, he had first been a lawyer and governor before a vision of street. Francis led him to abandon his worldly career and join the Franciscan order at age 30. He became one of the most famous preachers of his generation, drawing crowds of thousands wherever he spoke. He was frail and old, walking with a limp from decades of harsh ascetic practices, but he possessed a fire and charisma that could move mountains. His piercing blue eyes seemed to look into men's souls, and his voice could be heard over vast crowds without amplification. He had already organized successful preaching campaigns against heretics, and had even convinced some Jewish communities to convert. While the nobles of Hungary hesitated and debated, Capistrano took his appeal directly to the common people. He traveled the countryside of southern Hungary, a stark, black-robed figure whose fiery sermons, delivered in Latin that many couldn't even understand, somehow lit an unquenchable fire in the hearts of the faithful. He preached that this was no ordinary war but a holy crusade, the final battle between Christ and Antichrist. He told farmers that their plowshares should become swords, that their soul's salvation depended on standing against the infidel. He called on peasants, blacksmiths, students, and craftsmen to pick up whatever weapons they could find and march to save Christendom. His message was simple but electrifying. God would provide the victory if they provided the faith. And so the most unlikely alliance in medieval history was born. On one side, John Hunyadi, the pragmatic, battle-hardened general desperately trying to assemble a professional force with his own money and his hard-won military expertise. On the other, John of Capistrano, the zealous servant of God who believed that faith alone could build an army strong enough to defeat the world's greatest military power. The two men could hardly have been more different. Hunyadi was a practical soldier who understood logistics, tactics, and the hard realities of medieval warfare. Capistrano was a mystic who saw angels in his dreams and believed that prayer could stop cannonballs. Yet they shared an unshakable conviction that Belgrade must not fall, whatever the cost. Together, they represented something unique in European history, the union of military professionalism and popular religious enthusiasm. It was a combination that would prove more powerful than either man could have imagined. Capistrano's call to arms received a response that astonished everyone, especially the Hungarian nobility, who had dismissed the common people as irrelevant to serious warfare. From villages and towns across southern Hungary, they came in unprecedented numbers. They weren't soldiers in any conventional sense. They were farmers carrying scythes and flails, blacksmiths with their hammers, university students from Buda with nothing but courage and crucifixes, minor clergy armed with maces, urban craftsmen who had closed their shops to march to war. Some had proper weapons, hunting bows, crossbows, even a few old swords and axes. Most carried whatever they could find. They came on foot mostly, though some rode farm horses or mules. They brought their own food when they had it, slept under the stars, and followed a 70-year-old Italian priest who promised them that God would deliver victory against impossible odds. Contemporary accounts suggest their numbers swelled to over 40,000, making this one of the largest spontaneous military mobilizations in medieval European history. For Hunyadi, this mass movement was both salvation and nightmare. He desperately needed the numbers, but what he saw before him was a mob, not an army. How could peasants with farm tools stand against the disciplined charge of the Janissaries? How could their religious enthusiasm hold up against Mehmed's cannons? The tension between the two approaches was evident in everything. Hunyadi and Capistrano commanded their forces separately, united in ultimate purpose but divided in methods and expectations. The general focused on traditional military concerns, supplies, reconnaissance, defensive positions, and coordination with the Belgrade garrison. The priest, meanwhile, was the spiritual heart of the camp, holding daily masses, organizing prayer vigils, and constantly stoking the crusading zeal of his followers. What Capistrano had created was unlike any military force in European history. His followers wore red crosses sewn onto their clothes and carried banners with religious inscriptions. They sang hymns as they marched and treated their campaign as a pilgrimage as much as a military expedition. But beneath the religious enthusiasm lay something harder and more practical. These were men defending their homes, their families, and their way of life. They had heard the stories from Constantinople, of churches desecrated, of Christian children enslaved, of a proud empire reduced to ruins. They knew what Ottoman conquest meant, and they were determined to fight rather than submit. As Mehmed's army approached Belgrade in late June 1456, this strange mixed force was all that stood in its way. Inside the fortress itself, Hunyadi's brother-in-law, Mihaly Silagi, commanded a garrison of only 5,000 to 7,000 men. Outside the city, camped along the Danube, was this unprecedented alliance. Hunyadi's small professional army and Capistrano's enormous chaotic crusader host. Together, their total force numbered between 50,000 and 60,000 men, impressive in size but questionable in quality. They would face the storm together. Professional soldiers and amateur zealots, united by desperate necessity and the leadership of two remarkable men who refused to accept defeat. In the first days of July 1456, the Ottoman army arrived like a force of nature. An Ottoman chronicler described their white tents stretching across the plains south of Belgrade like a field of snow that covered the earth from horizon to horizon. The sight alone was designed to crush enemy morale, a city-sized military camp that demonstrated the overwhelming power of the Ottoman Empire. The Danube River, Belgrade's lifeline to the outside world, was immediately choked by an Ottoman fleet of around 200 vessels. This included not just warships but a massive flotilla of supply boats, troop transports, and specialized siege craft. The river blockade was designed to prevent any relief from reaching the city, while also serving as a base for naval artillery that could bombard the fortress from the water. On land, Mehmed's engineers began the methodical work of a professional siege. They dug networks of trenches and earthworks that would protect their forces from sorties while providing platforms for their artillery. The Ottoman army deployed in a careful formation that completely surrounded the city, with the elite Janissaries positioned directly opposite the main walls. The Sultan himself established his command post on a hill overlooking the fortress, where his distinctive red silk pavilion could be seen by defenders and attackers alike. From there, he could coordinate the entire siege operation while remaining safely out of range of the defenders' weapons. On the 4th of July, 1456, the bombardment began in earnest. The sound was unlike anything the medieval world had experienced, a constant thunder that echoed across the Danube Valley and could be heard for miles. Contemporary accounts describe it as the voice of the devil himself and thunder without end. For 3 weeks, the relentless bombardment continued from dawn to dusk. The Ottoman artillery was organized in 3 main batteries, each targeting a different section of Belgrade's walls. The largest cannons required teams of specialists to operate, men who understood the complex mathematics of trajectory and charge, who could predict wind and weather effects, and who risked death every time they fired their massive weapons. These weren't just big versions of smaller guns. The great siege cannons were engineering marvels that pushed 15th century metallurgy to its limits. They had to be cast in special foundries, transported by teams of oxen, and positioned with mathematical precision. When they fired, the ground shook for hundreds of yards, windows shattered in nearby buildings, and the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. The defenders inside Belgrade worked frantically to counter the bombardment. They built internal walls behind damaged sections, created earthwork barriers to absorb the impact of cannonballs, and developed techniques for rapid nighttime repairs. Teams of civilians worked alongside soldiers, carrying stones, timber, and earth to patch the growing gaps in their defenses. But it was a losing battle against the inexorable power of gunpowder. Medieval fortifications, no matter how thick or well built, were simply not designed to withstand the focused impact of heavy artillery. Day by day, the walls of Belgrade crumbled under the relentless pounding. The psychological pressure was immense. The constant noise made sleep impossible. The sight of massive stones flying through the air and smashing into buildings created a climate of terror. Defenders could see their walls literally disappearing under the bombardment, and everyone knew what would happen when the Ottomans finally judged the breaches wide enough for an assault. John Hunyadi, watching from his camp outside the city, knew he couldn't simply wait for the walls to fall completely. His first critical objective was to break the Ottoman naval blockade on the Danube. Without access to the river, he couldn't reinforce the exhausted garrison or supply them with the materials needed for their desperate defense. The problem was that the Ottoman fleet was both larger and more professional than anything Hunyadi could assemble. The Turks had real warships, galleys armed with cannons and crewed by experienced sailors who had fought battles from the Black Sea to the eastern Mediterranean. Hunyadi's makeshift flotilla consisted mainly of riverboats, fishing vessels, and hastily converted merchant ships. But the Hungarian commander had advantages too. His men knew the treacherous currents and shallows of the Danube better than any foreign sailors. His boats were smaller and more maneuverable. And most importantly, he had the element of surprise. On the 14th of July, Hunyadi launched his desperate gambit. In a carefully coordinated attack, his fleet of 200 smaller vessels charged directly at the Ottoman blockade in broad daylight. The battle that followed was one of the largest river engagements of the medieval period. The engagement lasted nearly 5 hours and was fought with a brutality typical of medieval warfare. Ottoman galleys tried to ram the smaller Hungarian vessels, while Hungarian crews used grappling hooks and boarding tactics to overcome their enemies' advantages in size and firepower. The fighting was especially fierce around the largest Ottoman vessels, which were essentially floating fortresses armed with multiple cannons. Hungarian fireboats, vessels loaded with combustible materials and set ablaze, were rammed into Ottoman ships, creating spectacular conflagrations that could be seen for miles. Contemporary accounts describe the river as running red with blood, littered with wreckage and bodies. The noise of the battle combined with the ongoing artillery bombardment created a hellish cacophony that witnesses compared to the end of the world. But Hunyadi's audacious strategy worked. By the end of the day, the Ottoman fleet had been shattered. Several large galleys had been sunk, dozens of smaller vessels captured, and the survivors driven away from Belgrade's waterfront. The blockade was broken, and the Danube was open. Hunyadi immediately rushed reinforcements and supplies to the exhausted garrison. Fresh troops, ammunition, food, and most importantly, materials for repairing the walls flowed into the beleaguered fortress. It was a crucial early victory that boosted morale throughout the Christian camp and demonstrated that the supposedly invincible Ottomans could be defeated. But Mehmed II was not easily deterred. The loss of his fleet was an annoyance, but his real power lay in his cannons and his elite infantry. If anything, the naval defeat made him more determined to take Belgrade quickly before Hunyadi could bring up additional reinforcements. The bombardment intensified, with Ottoman artillery now firing almost continuously. The Sultan brought up additional siege guns, including some of the massive weapons that had broken Constantinople. The ancient walls of Belgrade, already severely damaged, began to collapse entirely. By mid-July, whole sections of the outer fortifications had been reduced to rubble. The lower town was almost completely exposed, and even the upper fortress showed serious damage. Ottoman engineers crept forward under cover of darkness to examine the breaches and reported that they were wide enough for a full-scale assault. The defenders did what they could to prepare for the inevitable attack. They built barricades behind the collapsed walls, prepared stores of stones and boiling oil, and said what they believed might be their final prayers. Everyone knew that when the assault came, it would determine the fate not just of Belgrade, but of all Christian Europe. On the night of the 21st of July, 1456, Sultan Mehmed II ordered the final, all-out assault on Belgrade. Under cover of darkness, 40,000 elite Janissaries and supporting troops prepared for what was expected to be the decisive attack. Scaling ladders were brought forward, siege towers wheeled into position, and assault columns formed up in the Ottoman trenches. The attack began just before dawn, with a thunderous war cry that could be heard across the entire battlefield. Thousands of Janissaries poured through the breached walls and into Belgrade's lower town. They came in disciplined waves, each group having specific objectives and supporting the others in a carefully coordinated plan. The fighting was immediately brutal and desperate. The outnumbered defenders were pushed back street by street, fighting for every house, every courtyard, every stone. Ottoman discipline and training began to tell as they methodically cleared the lower town and pressed toward the main fortress. In the chaos of the night assault, with Janissaries swarming through Belgrade's streets, Hunyadi made a decision that demonstrated both his tactical genius and his willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. He ordered his men to collect every piece of combustible material they could find: oil-soaked wood, barrels of pitch, bales of hay, even furniture from abandoned houses. This material was thrown into the narrow medieval streets of the lower town and set ablaze. Within minutes, a wall of fire erupted between the thousands of Janissaries who had already broken through and the rest of the Ottoman army trying to follow them. The elite troops found themselves trapped in a burning maze, cut off from reinforcements and supplies, forced into a desperate house to house battle against defenders who knew every alley and courtyard. The flames created chaos in the Ottoman ranks and neutralized their advantages in numbers and coordination. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical one. Ottoman soldiers, who had been told they were about to complete an easy victory, suddenly found themselves surrounded by fire and fighting for their lives against enemies who seemed to appear from nowhere. In the most famous individual act of heroism during the siege, a Hungarian soldier named Titusz Dugovics spotted the Turkish fighter who had planted the Sultan's flag on the fortress wall. Rather than simply try to remove the banner, Dugovics grabbed the Turk and pulled them both off the wall to their deaths far below, ensuring that the symbol of defeat would not demoralize the remaining defenders. The Ottoman assault, which had seemed unstoppable just hours before, began to falter. The elite Janissaries, trapped by fire and facing fanatical resistance, suffered enormous casualties. As dawn broke on the 22nd of July, the attack was finally repelled with devastating losses to the attackers. The morning of the 22nd of July rose on a scene of carnage and exhaustion Belgrade had held, but just barely. The walls were in ruins, the lower town was a smoking wasteland, and both sides had suffered terrible casualties. Hunyadi surveyed the damage and gave strict orders: no one was to leave the fortress. They had to repair what they could and prepare for the next inevitable assault. The Hungarian general knew his Peasant Crusaders were no match for Ottoman professionals in an open-field battle. His strategy was purely defensive: hold the fortress, make the Ottomans pay for every inch, and hope that disease or supply problems would eventually force them to withdraw. But what happened next wasn't part of any general's plan. It was a moment of spontaneous religious fervor that changed the course of history. A small group of Capistrano's crusaders, positioned in forward posts near the Ottoman lines, began sneaking out to harass enemy soldiers who were trying to salvage equipment from the previous night's battle. What started as minor skirmishing quickly escalated when Ottoman cavalry tried to drive them back. But the Peasant Crusaders, armed with their farm tools and inflamed by religious passion, refused to retreat. More joined them, then more. What had begun as a few dozen men grew to hundreds, then thousands, as Capistrano's entire Crusader army spontaneously joined the fight. John of Capistrano, seeing his followers streaming toward the Ottoman lines in complete violation of orders, initially tried to call them back. But when he realized that nothing could stop their religious fervor, he made a decision that defied all military logic. The 70-year-old friar ran to the front of the disorganized mob, held his large crucifix high above his head, and led them forward into the teeth of the Ottoman army, his voice roaring across the battlefield. "The Lord who made the beginning will take care of the ending." It was a suicidal charge, an act of pure faith that violated every principle of military science. Thousands of untrained peasants with improvised weapons were running directly at the most professional army in the world. By every rational calculation, it should have ended in massacre. But something extraordinary happened. The sight of this vast mob of screaming crusaders, led by an old priest carrying a crucifix, created panic and confusion in the Ottoman ranks. Many Turkish soldiers had never seen anything like it, an army that seemed to welcome death, that fought with a ferocity born of absolute religious conviction. Watching from the fortress walls, John Hunyadi was initially horrified. His entire defensive strategy was collapsing before his eyes. But as he saw the peasant charge creating chaos in the Ottoman camp, he realized this might be his one and only chance to achieve something impossible. Making the decision of a lifetime, he unleashed his own forces in a perfectly coordinated cavalry charge. His 3,000 heavy cavalry, the cream of Hungarian knighthood, thundered out of Belgrade's gates in disciplined formation, smashing into the Ottoman flank, while the enemy was still reeling from the Crusader assault. The timing was perfect. The Ottoman army found itself caught between two completely different but equally devastating attacks. On one side, a screaming wave of religious fanatics who seemed immune to fear. On the other, some of Europe's finest heavy cavalry executing a textbook military maneuver. Hunyadi's knights drove straight for the Ottoman artillery park, the cannons that had been pounding Belgrade for 3 weeks. In one of the most dramatic reversals in military history, they captured the great siege guns and turned them on their former masters, firing directly into the Ottoman camp and the Sultan's personal bodyguard. The combination of the peasant charge and the cavalry assault created complete chaos in the Ottoman ranks. Soldiers who had been confident of victory just hours before now found themselves surrounded, outflanked, and fighting for their lives against enemies who seemed to be everywhere at once. Panic spread through the Ottoman camp like wildfire. Units began to break and flee without orders. The carefully organized siege lines collapsed as soldiers abandoned their positions to save themselves. Even the elite Janissaries, the backbone of Ottoman military power, began to waver in the face of this unprecedented assault. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, fought desperately to rally his troops. He rode directly into the battle, shouting orders and trying to restore discipline to his collapsing army. But in the chaos, he was wounded in the thigh by an arrow. Whether shot by a Hungarian archer or a fleeing Ottoman soldier was never determined. The sight of their wounded sultan was the final blow to Ottoman morale. The army that had seemed invincible just that morning dissolved into a fleeing mob. Soldiers abandoned their equipment, their supplies, even their wounded comrades in their desperate haste to escape. Under cover of darkness on the 22nd of July, the shattered remains of the great Ottoman army retreated southward, leaving behind their magnificent camp, their powerful artillery, and thousands of dead. The withdrawal was so hasty that they abandoned supplies worth a fortune and military equipment that would take years to replace. Sultan Mehmed II, upon regaining consciousness and learning the full scale of the disaster, was said to have fallen into a deep depression. Court chroniclers reported that he had to be physically restrained from taking his own life, so overwhelming was his shame at the defeat. The man who had conquered Constantinople, who had styled himself as the heir to Caesar and Alexander, had been beaten by a ragtag army of peasants and a handful of knights. The victory at Belgrade was absolute, one of the greatest military upsets in medieval history. An Ottoman army that had seemed unstoppable had been not just defeated but routed, its reputation for invincibility shattered by the most unlikely of opponents. But the victory came at a terrible price that cast a shadow over the triumph. In the aftermath of the siege, with thousands of bodies lying under the summer sun and the sanitary conditions in the camps deteriorating rapidly. Plague broke out among both the Hungarian forces and the civilian population of Belgrade. The disease, possibly typhus or bubonic plague, spread with terrifying speed through the overcrowded camps. It claimed victims indiscriminately: veteran soldiers, enthusiastic crusaders, and innocent civilians, all fell to the invisible enemy that no amount of courage or faith could defeat. The plague would claim the lives of the siege's two greatest heroes, robbing Christendom of the very men who had engineered its salvation. John Hunyadi, the brilliant general who had held together an impossible alliance and engineered one of history's greatest military upsets, died just 3 weeks after his triumph on the 11th of August, 1456. He was only 49 years old. A few months later, on the 23rd of October, 1456, John of Capistrano also succumbed to the disease. The warrior priest, whose faith had inspired an army and whose leadership had turned a mob into a military force capable of defeating an empire, died at the age of 70, just as he was preparing to organize another crusade. They were heroes who didn't live to see the lasting peace their sacrifice had won, but their legacy was already secure. The incredible victory at Belgrade halted the Ottoman advance into Central Europe for the next 70 years. It wasn't until 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, that Ottoman forces would again seriously threaten the Hungarian heartland. By then, the strategic situation had changed dramatically, and Europe had gained precious time to strengthen its defenses and develop new military technologies. The siege became a symbol of hope across Christendom, proving that the Ottoman Empire, despite its fearsome reputation, was not invincible. News of the victory was greeted with celebration from London to Naples, and it inspired renewed resistance to Ottoman expansion throughout the Balkans and Eastern Europe. The impact on Ottoman morale and strategy was profound. Mehmed II, who had seemed destined to conquer all of Europe, never again launched such an ambitious campaign into Christian territory. The psychological blow of the defeat affected Ottoman military thinking for decades, making them more cautious about deep penetrations into European territory. The victory also had immediate diplomatic consequences. European kingdoms that had been preparing to submit to Ottoman overlordship instead began forming new alliances. The Papal States organized fresh crusading expeditions. Venice renewed its resistance in the eastern Mediterranean. Even distant England sent financial aid to support the defense of Christendom's frontiers. Perhaps most importantly, the victory demonstrated the power of unity between different social classes and military traditions. The combination of Hunyadi's professional soldiers and Capistrano's popular crusade had achieved what neither could have accomplished alone. It showed that military success could come from the most unexpected quarters when ordinary people were inspired by extraordinary leadership. The financial cost of the failed siege was enormous for the Ottoman Empire. The loss of the artillery train alone represented years of investment and the work of the empire's best engineers and craftsmen. The abandoned supplies and equipment were captured by the Christians and used to strengthen other fortresses along the frontier. More significantly, the defeat revealed weaknesses in Ottoman military organization that their enemies could exploit. The rigid command structure that had been a strength in victory became a liability when things went wrong. The elite Janissaries, who had seemed invincible, proved vulnerable to unconventional tactics and unexpected circumstances. The story of Belgrade also highlighted the crucial role of logistics in medieval warfare. Mehmed's army, despite its size and professional organization, had struggled to maintain effective supply lines so far from its base. The Christian forces, fighting on familiar territory with local support, had significant advantages that offset their numerical inferiority. For the common people of Europe, the victory became a source of pride and inspiration that lasted for generations. Folk songs and stories about the siege spread across the continent, celebrating not just the noble leaders, but the ordinary farmers and craftsmen who had stood against an empire. It became proof that common people could make a difference in the great events of history. The religious dimension of the victory was equally important. The success of Capistrano's crusade, validated popular religious enthusiasm, and showed that faith could be a powerful military force when properly organized and led. Churches across Europe commissioned artwork depicting the battle, often showing divine intervention in the Christian victory. The bells of Europe continued to ring at noon as Pope Calixtus III had ordered, but now they rang in celebration rather than desperate prayer. The tradition spread even to Protestant regions after the Reformation, as all Christians could appreciate the significance of the victory over Islamic expansion. In Hungary itself, the victory became a foundational myth of national resistance. Despite the country's eventual conquest by the Ottomans, the memory of Belgrade inspired future generations of Hungarian patriots. The siege was remembered as proof that Hungarian valor, when properly led and supported, could achieve miracles against overwhelming odds. The defeat also had long-term consequences for Ottoman expansion strategy. Future sultans would be more cautious about ambitious campaigns far from their supply bases. They would invest more heavily in siege artillery and engineering, learning from the lessons of Belgrade, but they would also be more aware of the dangers of popular resistance and religious enthusiasm. Mehmed II himself, despite his depression after the defeat, learned valuable lessons that he applied in later campaigns. He became more systematic in his approach to sieges, more careful about logistics, and more aware of the psychological dimensions of warfare. These lessons served him well in subsequent conquests, though he never again attempted such an ambitious assault on the heart of Europe. The victory at Belgrade also demonstrated the importance of competent military leadership at every level. Hunyadi's tactical brilliance, Capistrano's inspirational leadership, and even the individual heroism of fighters like Titusz Dugovics all contributed to the final outcome. It showed that wars are won not just by numbers and equipment, but by the quality of leadership and the courage of individual soldiers. The joy in Rome was unprecedented when news of the miraculous victory arrived. Pope Calixtus III had ordered the bells of every church in Europe to be rung every day at noon before the battle, calling for prayers for Belgrade's defenders. When messengers brought word of the incredible triumph, carried by fast riders who changed horses at every stop across the continent, the meaning of the noon bell was transformed forever. What had begun as a desperate plea for divine intervention became a celebration of answered prayers. The Pope declared that the noon bell should continue to ring in perpetuity, as a reminder of God's mercy and the power of faith united with courage. This tradition, begun in that desperate summer of 1456, continues to this day across the Christian world. In Catholic churches around the globe, and in many old Protestant churches that maintained the custom even after the Reformation, bells still ring at noon, a living echo of that extraordinary day when faith triumphed over seemingly impossible odds. Every time those bells ring, they carry across the centuries the memory of a veteran general and a warrior priest who refused to accept defeat. They remember professional soldiers and amateur crusaders who found strength in unity, and ordinary people who achieved something extraordinary because they believed it was right. They commemorate the moment when a handful of heroes stood against an empire and proved that history isn't always made by the largest armies, but sometimes by the biggest hearts. The Siege of Belgrade stands as one of history's most powerful demonstrations that military success isn't always determined by numbers, technology, or professional training. Sometimes, the decisive factors are leadership, faith, and the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. John Hunyadi proved that brilliant tactics and strategic thinking could overcome seemingly impossible odds. John of Capistrano demonstrated that moral leadership and spiritual conviction could transform a mob into a military force capable of defeating the world's most powerful army. Together, they showed that different approaches to warfare, professional and popular, tactical and spiritual, could complement each other in ways that multiplied their individual strengths. Their victory saved not just Belgrade, but the entire course of European history. It preserved the independence of Central Europe, gave Christianity time to reform and strengthen itself, and proved that even the mightiest empires were not invincible when faced with determined resistance.